Good afternoon and welcome to the Media Conference 2015. I'm Natasha Jones and today we are looking at the course of terrorism, violence and moral panic in relation to the British broadcast. It is fair to say that the media often tends to favour the more tragic or blood-curdling news stories. Why is this? Is it because it is important for the public to know the truth, no matter how grim? Or can the media be accused of sensationalising stories and creating widespread moral panic? Just like TV dramas or magazines, the sole aim for most broadcasts is to gain and hold viewers. British media outlets must ensure they have the commitment and loyalty of the public and therefore a consistent audience. Research shows that most people tend to watch and read the same outlets throughout their entire lives. By developing this imperishable bond, television, radio and print are able to build trust with their audience. This control of the British media allows them to create solid stereotypes within the British public. With headlines and imagery of troubled youths, for example, regularly appearing across the British media, the audience have formed an image of the criminal from the thousands of pictures and words used to describe this group of offenders. Of course, in reality, we know that not every youth wearing a hooded sweatshirt are a danger to us. However, the media makes us believe that they are. Their consistent distortion and exaggeration of simple moral panics are creating a huge rise in public concern and a deep divide in society. After the 9/11 attack and the visible moral panics created, there's been noticeable difficulties distinguishing between crime and terrorism. Our guest speaker, Nick Cartwright, highlights how terrorism was always illegal under British legislation. However, since the general public fear of terrorists has grown, the government have instilled further law enforcement and this could be deemed as unnecessary. The infamous 2011 London riots are a prime example of this now. These attacks can be viewed as a terrorist case where an all-consuming moral panic was created. Although the London riots were in theory a rebellion after the death of Mark Duggan at the hands of the police, the riots were televised across the British media and the country watched in terror, afraid to leave their houses. The New York Times called it an apocalyptic London. So shortly after a plethora of global terrorist attacks such as 9/11 and 7/7, the public tends to view any event that instills fear as a terrorist scare. The media placed the responsibility of these attacks upon the heads of the British teenagers, and therefore they were seen as a threat. A total of 3,100 people were arrested. However, judges were criticised of imposing overly harsh sentences as a result of moral panic that had consumed the nation in relation to British teenagers. The news came after a university student who stole some alcohol from a Tesco store was handed a 16-month jail sentence. Lord MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions in England and Wales, recognised how there appeared to be a lack of consistency and fairness amongst these sentences, all for very similar crimes. In times of extreme social turmoil, it seems that even the law can be overcome with panic and fear. In this conference, we'll be focusing specifically on how terrorism and violence are portrayed in the British broadcast and the widespread reaction this creates. Additionally, we will review how the broadcast regulator Ofcom deals with these issues. The methods of coverage chosen by the British media have helped build terrorism into one of the most intense moral panics in history. Sam will discuss these in detail through our chosen case studies. In recent years, the word terrorism has become entrenched in discourse across the British media. The presentation of Muslims and Islam in the global media have contributed to excessive levels of heightened fear and a misguided public consciousness. The decision by newspapers and television outlets as to whether to show terrorist activities in their coverage can be a complex one. Although it is in the public interest to be educated about recent terrorist activities, it can be ruled as too disturbing to cover in detail by media outlets. In the case of the Lee Rigby murder, for example, a video of the slaughter circulated, and ITV were the only network that chose to show it to the public. Sam will discuss this case and ITV's decision in detail, and additionally will highlight the criticisms made by the public of them choosing to air the brutal footage. It is important to remember that the media are regulated by Parliament through laws and censors such as the Race Relations Act and the Official Secrets Act. However, the most prominent body of regulation is known as Ofcom. They consider broadcast material after it's received a considerable amount of complaints by the public. They also offer a set of guidelines for outlets to refer to to avoid networks from breaching the conduct and being fined or having their licence revoked. However, Ofcom themselves do not have the power to preempt how an audience are going to react to disturbing terrorism content, but this does not mean they do not successfully regulate the broadcast. Zara Haider will now present her paper, which discusses the role of Ofcom in further detail and will evaluate if Ofcom has any control over the creation of moral panics in the media. Some viewers may find some content shown at today's conference disturbing.
The Office of Communications, better known as Ofcom, is responsible for regulating electronic communications such as television, radio, mobile and internet communications to some extent. It was set up in 2003 by the Labour government in response to the rapid rise in telecommunications and broadcasting technology and the growth of broadcasting outlets. As well as ensuring that people in the UK get the best from their communication services, Ofcom also has a duty to protect the public from material which may be harmful or offensive. This is done in the interest of citizens and is based on the Communications Act 2003 and the Broadcasting Act 1996. As outlined on Ofcom's website, some of their main legal duties are to ensure that a wide range of high-quality TV and radio programs are provided which cater to a variety of tastes and interests, as well as protecting people from being treated unfairly in TV and radio programs, especially by having their privacy invaded. However, Ofcom is not responsible for regulating newspapers and magazines, or the content of radio and TV adverts, nor the accuracy in BBC programs. According to Franklin, Ofcom and IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation, have different interpretations of what the public interest involves. According to Ofcom, examples of public interest includes uncovering or detecting crime, protecting public health and safety, and protecting the location of a person's home or family unless it's warranted. The Ofcom Code has an impact on broadcast material and is concerned with the following: protecting people under 18 from material that may seriously impair their physical, mental, or moral development, enforcing the watershed and ensuring that broadcasters observe this period of time between 5:30 a.m. and 9 p.m., which is when children are most likely to be watching, so material scheduled for that time should be appropriate for them. Making sure that the transition to watershed is not abrupt and that warnings are provided in case there is material that may be distressing to children. Similarly, making sure that radio follows a similar rule where offensive content is limited during breakfast time, as a watershed rule applies only to TV broadcasting. Ensuring that demonstrations of the paranormal, occult, and similar practices are treated with due objectivity so as to not mislead audiences. Making sure that, unless justified, methods of suicide and self-harm must not be broadcast. Taking precautions to maintain a low-level risk to viewers with photosensitive epilepsy. One significant part of the Ofcom Code deals with preventing material which is likely to encourage crime and other violent behaviour from being broadcast. Material which can instigate the commission of crime or lead to public disorder must not be included in TV or radio services. Alongside that, material which is broadcast must not endanger lives or prejudice the success of attempts to deal with either a hijacking or a kidnapping. In 2012, Ofcom shut down the Iranian news network Press TV. Press TV's licence was revoked, meaning they could no longer be broadcast in the UK. The decision came after an investigation showed that editorial decisions on the channel were being controlled from Iran instead of the UK. The network also failed to pay a £100,000 fine the year before, which was imposed after an interview was ruled by Ofcom to be conducted under duress, which was broadcast. However, a reporter for Press TV commented that the closure of the network is essentially an act of censorship. The channel continues to be broadcast online, which goes to show that despite being able to regulate television, Ofcom does not have a lot of control over what's broadcast online. Ed Richards, Chief Executive of Ofcom, says that organisations such as Google and Facebook should be more involved in controlling what content is available online. In 2013, Ofcom received almost 680 complaints about the footage of the killing of Lee Rigby, according to BBC News. The footage was broadcast on several news outlets, and many people complained, saying that they found the images graphic, distressing, and disrespectful to the Rigby family. Ofcom later ruled that the detailed coverage of the murder was justified by the context. However, the watchdog set out new guidance to broadcasters, emphasising the importance of giving viewers appropriate warnings before broadcasting material which may be distressing or offensive. The role of Ofcom plays a big part in the concept of moral panic, as Dan suggests. As Ofcom regulates what is broadcast on television and radio, they essentially can prevent material which can incite moral panic. According to Critcher, the media's coverage of crime and terrorism can come across as sensationalist, which invokes a sense of moral panic amongst the public. It's essential to make sure coverage of news involving terrorism is impartial, factual, and not sensationalist. Coverage of sensitive topics such as terrorism or any other criminal acts should not create a sense of public alarm, and this is why media outlets need to be regulated by bodies like Ofcom.
Thank you, Zara. Our correspondent Zach Patel-Champion interviewed Nick Cartwright, a senior lecturer in law from the University of Northampton, to find out his views on the coverage of violence and terrorism in the media.
I can't see any problems with reporting news or events that have happened. I have no issues with facts being made available. I think that any form of censorship is to be questioned. However, I would question what if the violence was gratuitous or the terrorism was being broadcast for reasons other than information or news.
Sometimes it could be argued that reporting on terrorism or extreme violence could be shown as perhaps over-sensationalized, or in cases of terrorism, perhaps glamorizing a topic that they shouldn't be allowed a platform. What do you think about that?
I think that any limitations on freedom of expression, any limitations on free speech, and anything that was censorship is a very scary route to go down. I think that the best way to counter a view you disagree with is to exercise your freedom of expression. So my view would be that if it's happened, if there's an event, if it's being broadcast as news, that any movement by the state to restrict what can be broadcast as news would amount to censorship. And I think that would be a scary situation to put ourselves in, where the state was allowed to dictate what we were or weren't allowed to know about things that were happening around the world.
Okay, so with regards to yourself being a lecturer in law, it seems to me that you're saying that there shouldn't be more laws introduced to introduce new regulations on what can and can't be broadcast. Would you agree? Would you say that perhaps maybe there should be less laws with that?
There's been 14 terror acts in the last 7 years, an awful lot of them to criminalise things that are already criminal. Most of what terrorists do is a crime in and of itself. The fact that it's done by terrorists then makes it terrorism. But most of the activities that terrorists involve themselves with are already crimes. So we're already at a point where we're legislating to make things illegal that are already illegal. We've already got laws that make it illegal to glorify terrorism, to encourage terrorism, and those laws have been used to restrict political protest, to restrict legitimate protest within a democratic society. It seems that where these powers are granted, they're used much more broadly than to deal with terrorism, and ultimately they erode civil liberties and human rights. And that's a dangerous road to go down. So I certainly wouldn't be in favour of any more draconian laws or any restrictions on freedom of expression. And I think there is an argument that could be made, a very strong argument, that says that civil liberties have already been restricted too much with the use of terrorism as a reason, possibly an excuse.
Okay, so with that sort of mindset in place, do you think that having things like social media such as YouTube and Twitter and Tumblr allows for a broader spectrum of sort of reporting to happen on such cases? Do you think that's a good thing that we have those social medias in place?
Broadly, yes. The advantage of an unrestricted or a poorly restricted social media is that, yes, there may be views you don't like out there, but there are also counters to those views. So anyone who wishes to explore an issue will see maybe views they dislike, but also views that they like and challenge that. And that's open debate. That's what should be happening in a free society. People should be able to express their views, however much I disagree with them and however hideous they are. And then I ought to be able to counter those views and argue against them. And actually having that out in the public space, I think, is a much safer place to be than to drive people underground. Because ultimately, if people want to spread a message, they will spread a message. If they can do it in a way that's public and open, and we can have a discourse about that message and challenge it, that seems to be a much healthier situation than that message being spread underground with the threat of legal sanctions.
Okay, and do you think perhaps, while that is a good sort of platform for reporting to take place, do you think perhaps the more traditional, sort of the newspapers and reporting in a traditional sense could perhaps lead to moral panics where people becoming perhaps over-worrying about or overthinking about circumstances that could potentially not be a danger to themselves?
It's certainly true that the media fuels moral panics, and it's certainly true that moral panics fuel fear. But moral panics are used more by governments than they are by any other organisations. When governments wish to legislate, they use moral panics. The fear of terrorism has allowed for legislation to be passed that has restricted our rights to legitimate protest against governments. The legislation that defines a terrorist as anyone who tries to disrupt things for political means captures an awful lot of people who are protesting against governments. It makes it very difficult to oppose a tyrannical government without breaching the terrorism legislation. So, yes, it is true that reporting can lead to moral panics, and yes, that can fuel fear, and fear can allow things to happen. But generally, what moral panics do is they create legislative knee-jerk responses. We hand power to governments because we're afraid. We allow them to restrict our civil liberties, and they use the opportunity to create laws. I mean, we have all sorts of examples. So if you think about the Dangerous Dogs Act, which is widely regarded as the worst drafted piece of legislation ever written, it's a terrible piece of legislation. It was done immediately in response to dog attacks because the public were afraid, and they said to the government, have some more power, legislate about this. So moral panics tend to create bad law and bad government rather than what you were suggesting in the question, I think, which is provoke people to protest or to be radicalised or to join in with illegal activity.
Now we go over to Sam Geary, who will be focusing on specific case studies of violence and terrorism, including the murder of Lee Rigby.
One of these cases include the killing of Lee Rigby. In May 2013, Ofcom received almost 680 complaints about a number of news programmes that were aired relating to the killing of Lee Rigby. The regulator revealed that the content was under investigation because of the complaints made about the brutality of the video. It was also under investigation because the content was very distressing and may not have been deemed suitable for children. According to researcher Dant, the audiovisual depiction of suffering is particularly powerful in evoking an emotional response of care and concern in those confronted with it. The investigation was made because of the possible breach of the Ofcom Broadcasting Code. Sections 1.3 reveal that children must be protected by appropriate scheduling from material that is unsuitable for them. Ofcom defined the age of children as under 15. The second part of the rule that was under investigation was Section 2.3. In applying generally accepted standards, broadcasters must ensure that material which may cause offence is justified by context. Appropriate information should also be broadcast where it would assist in avoiding or minimising offence. Appropriate scheduling is defined as the time of broadcast and the nature of the content. The full video was edited and carefully decided upon whether it was suitable for public viewing. When the video was aired, some news programmes warned viewers of the graphic scenes they were about to witness before displaying the video. The footage was first featured on the 6:30 ITV News Bulletin. This was before the 9 p.m. watershed. Ofcom received nearly 700 complaints about the footage, which included shocking images of one of Lee Rigby's killers with blood on his hands. Ofcom said, whilst the coverage was detailed and at times distressing, we did not consider that the images were too offensive for broadcast, given they were appropriately scheduled and justified by the context. Images of the dead body were not the centre of the attention, and the attacker speaking to the phone camera was kept short. Ofcom also stated that the channels the footage was aired on were not considered to attract younger viewers, especially the rolling news channels. According to Ofcom, between 94% and 100% of all viewers are adults for the channels that the footage was broadcasted on. Ofcom also took into consideration the amount of time the news programmes had to decide whether to air the footage. Editorial decisions had to be made within half an hour. Most channels gave verbal warnings. The footage could have offended the public, but because the circumstances were so rare, it was thought that the public needed to understand the full severity of the attack by showing the video. Some believe that airing the mobile phone footage on numerous news channels gave the attackers a platform to justify themselves and explain to the public why they did this brutal crime. The footage sparked very significant reactions which showed how seriously it was considered. The Ministry of Defence advised all military personnel not to wear uniform in public to prevent singling out like Rigby was. They also increased all security in London. Ofcom came to the conclusion that the footage was aired in the public interest. They stated that rules 1.3 and 2.3 were complied with. The Ofcom report explains that the footage was shown to give the public adequate information about the attack and to inform them on what happened that day. The airing of the video was deemed necessary because of the severity of the incident. The event was a major story and a national event, and it was believed that it could have been a matter of public security because of other potential threats. Ofcom also decided to set some new guidance to broadcasters that included giving the viewers a warning before airing material that could be classed as offensive or distressing. Some may ask, where did Ofcom draw the line? In 2006, Ofcom ruled that the GMTV channel breached sections 2.3 by showing CCTV images of an unprovoked knife attack by 3 men on 2 students. Ofcom said the violent images were already being seen on the screen by the time the newsreader completed an introductory sentence, and the tone of the introduction did not bear any sense of warning about the shocking images broadcast. Ofcom said this casual use of exceptionally violent material added to the potential of causing offence to viewers. As mentioned before, since then, Ofcom have set new guidance to broadcasters that require them to give a warning before broadcasting anything that could be considered distressing.
Government legislation does have some control of the media's reporting of terrorism and violence. We will now open the question of moral panic in broadcast up to our panel. So do you think there should be harsher regulation put in place when reporting on cases of terrorism and violence?
I'd say yes, because the news focuses on distressing stories, and words like terrorism and murder cause panic amongst the public. But on the other hand, the public have the right to know what's going on in the world, and it's in the public interest. So, and the news broadcasters have a duty to tell the public what's going on in the world.
And do you believe Ofcom provide a substantial amount of protection for the public against moral panic?
Well, there is a dilemma here, because as Ofcom can regulate coverage of criminal activity, but ultimately, no matter how regulated the news is, they can't control how the public will respond to it, which is essentially how moral panic arises. And it raises the question of how much can news be censored before it stops being impartial, and is it better to censor the news to protect the public or not?
Thank you, Sam and Zara, for contributing your papers today, and to Nick Cartwright for taking part in the conference. Thanks for watching the Media Conference 2015. Goodbye for now.